when saving meant shaming. Ancient Filipino sexuality. When Spanish priests arrived in the Philippines in the 1500s, they were horrified. Filipino women had premarital relationships without shame. Couples divorced freely. The concept of virginity didn't exist. Sex wasn't sin, it was natural. The Spanish called this barbarism. But what they actually found was sexual freedom that wouldn't return to the West for another 400 years. This is the story of what Filipinos lost when the church arrived to save them. What the priests found. Spanish missionary accounts from the 1500s and 1600s are filled with shock and disgust at Filipino sexual practices. But read between their moral panic, and you find something remarkable. A society with fundamentally different attitudes about sex, relationships, and the human body. Friar Gaspar de San Agustin wrote in 1703, "These natives are very much given to sins of the flesh." Translation: Filipinos had sex and weren't ashamed of it. Another friar complained that young Filipinos engaged in trial marriages before formal unions. They lived together, had sexual relationships, and if incompatible, separated without stigma. No scandal, no punishment, no concept that they'd been ruined. The Tagalog language had no word that directly translated to virginity as a moral virtue. There were words describing physical state, but none carrying the religious weight of purity and sin that Spanish priests expected. This wasn't an oversight. It reflected a completely different worldview. Premarital relationships were normal. In pre-colonial Philippines, young people courted openly. Men and women interacted freely without chaperones. Sexual relationships before marriage weren't forbidden or shameful. They were expected parts of courtship. The pandango and other traditional dances involved close physical contact, flirtation, and public courtship displays. Spanish priests tried to ban these dances, calling them obscene and provocative. But to Filipinos, they were normal social activities. Young couples often engaged in what Spanish records called nocturnal visits, men visiting women at night with family knowledge and tacit approval. These weren't scandals. They were how people got to know potential spouses, including sexually. If a pregnancy resulted, marriage usually followed, but not because of shame. Communities saw children as blessings, not evidence of sin. Single mothers weren't outcasts. The concept of a child being illegitimate didn't exist in the same way. Marriage was a contract, not a sacrament. Pre-colonial Filipino marriage was a social and economic arrangement between families, not a religious sacrament. And critically, it was dissolvable. Couples could separate for incompatibility, adultery, abuse, or simply mutual agreement. Women retained their property, often kept the children, and could remarry immediately without stigma. One Spanish friar wrote with frustration, "They marry and unmarry with great ease, the woman returning to her parents' house with all she brought to the marriage." He saw this as moral chaos, but what it actually was, women having autonomy over their own lives and bodies. The Visayan practice of trial marriage particularly scandalized the Spanish. Couples lived together for months or years before formalizing the union. If it didn't work, they separated. No priest needed, no sin committed, just two people deciding they weren't compatible. Compare this to Catholic Spain, where marriage was permanent and indissoluble. A woman could be beaten, abandoned, cheated on. She stayed married. Divorce didn't exist. Annulment required wealth and church approval. Women had no exit. Filipinos had what modern feminists call reproductive autonomy, centuries before the term existed. Bodies weren't shameful. Spanish accounts describe Filipinos wearing minimal clothing in tropical heat, loincloths for men, wrapped skirts for women, often bare-chested. The Spanish were scandalized. They associated exposed skin with sexual immorality. But to Filipinos, bodies were just bodies. Nudity wasn't inherently sexual. Communal bathing was normal. Breastfeeding in public was unremarkable. The human form wasn't shameful. It was natural. Spanish missionaries immediately imposed European modesty standards. They forced Filipinos to cover up, associated exposed skin with sin, and taught that bodies were sources of temptation and shame. Within generations, Filipinos internalized this shame as if it had always been their culture. Sexual knowledge was open. Pre-colonial Filipinos had sophisticated knowledge about sex, reproduction, and contraception. Babilans and traditional healers knew herbal abortifacients and contraceptive methods. This knowledge was passed down, particularly among women. Spanish priests saw this as witchcraft and devil worship. They banned these practices, burned the herbal knowledge, and executed Babilans who refused to stop. The church's position was clear. Sex was for procreation within marriage only. Anything else was sin. The loss of this knowledge had consequences. Filipinos went from having some reproductive control to having none. Women lost access to traditional methods that had given them autonomy over their bodies, same-sex relationships, and gender fluidity. Spanish records also document what they called sodomites and people who lived as the opposite gender. The Asog in Visayas and Bayoc in other regions were individuals assigned male at birth who lived as women, often serving as babaylans. These individuals weren't outcasts. They held respected spiritual and social roles. Their gender identity wasn't seen as sin or disorder. It was understood as a spiritual calling. Spanish authorities brutally punished same-sex acts and forced gender non-conforming individuals to conform or face execution. The church taught that these identities were abominations. Within a few generations, the acceptance disappeared, replaced by the homophobia and transphobia that persists in the Philippines today. How the church changed everything. The Spanish didn't just evangelize, they weaponized shame. Catholic doctrine taught that the body is sinful and must be controlled. Sex outside marriage is mortal sin. Virginity, especially female, is sacred virtue. Divorce is impossible. Desire itself is dangerous. Women's sexuality especially must be controlled. They built this system through confession. Filipinos had to confess sexual sins to priests, creating surveillance and control over the most intimate parts of life. Priests recorded who had premarital sex, who lived together unmarried, who sought divorce. Public shaming and punishment followed. Schools run by friars taught girls that their value lay in purity, that their bodies were temptations, that sexual desire was shameful. Convents emphasized virginity as the highest female virtue. Within a few generations, Filipino culture transformed. The sexual openness Spanish priests documented in the 1500s was gone by the 1700s. It was replaced by the Catholic sexual shame that defines Filipino culture today. The tragic irony: Spain justified colonization as bringing civilization and morality to savages. But pre-colonial Filipino sexual culture had elements that modern progressive societies advocate for. Consent-based relationships, sexual autonomy for women, divorce rights, acceptance of gender diversity, body positivity, reproductive knowledge and choice. Spain didn't bring sexual liberation. They brought sexual repression and repackaged it as salvation. What remains? The damage persists. The Philippines still has no divorce law, one of only 2 countries in the world without it, along with Vatican City. Catholic opposition blocks it. Comprehensive sex education faces church resistance. Contraception access is limited. Abortion is illegal with no exceptions. LGBTQ plus rights lag behind regional neighbors. Shame around sexuality remains deeply embedded, but cracks are showing. Younger Filipinos question purity culture. Feminist movements challenge Catholic sexual doctrine. LGBTQ plus Filipinos fight for recognition. These aren't Western imports. They're echoes of something ancient that the church tried to erase but never fully killed. The bottom line: when Spanish priests saw Filipinos without sexual shame, they didn't see freedom. They saw souls in need of saving. So they saved them by teaching them to hate their bodies, fear their desires, and police each other's sexuality. 400 years later, Filipinos still carry that shame, still believe it's part of their culture, still think Catholic sexual morality is Filipino morality. But it's not, it never was. Pre-colonial Filipinos understood something the church couldn't accept: that bodies aren't shameful, desire isn't sin, and freedom doesn't require guilt. The priests wrote it all down: their shock, their disgust, their desperate attempts to impose control. They documented the very freedom they destroyed, never realizing they were creating evidence of their own cultural violence. That evidence remains. And every time someone questions why Filipino culture is so sexually repressive, why shame runs so deep, why the church still controls bodies and relationships, the answer is in those Spanish missionary accounts. They told us we needed saving. What they meant was we needed controlling. And the cruelest part? They convinced us to be grateful.